Grab your favorite beverage. It's time for the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast.
What's up, Fantasy Freaks and Geeks? Welcome to the Week 4, Part 2 edition of the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. Last week we had 6 backup quarterbacks start in the NFL, and I got to say they did a hell of a lot better than I thought they were going to do. Gardner Minshew with 2 touchdown passes on Thursday Night Football. Mason Rudolph, 2 touchdown passes against San Francisco, who's actually starting to look like a pretty good defense. Daniel Jones, 2 passing touchdowns, 2 rushing touchdowns in his debut as the starter with the Giants. Kyle Allen came in for Cam Newton and threw 4 touchdown passes against, albeit a horrible Cardinals defense. And Luke Falk, who came in and as a backup played for the New York Jets, and he only got 2 fantasy points, even though he played the entire game. Of course, it's the Jets that are on their third quarterback. Thank God for the Dolphins and the Redskins, or else the Jets would be by far the worst team in the NFL. This Part 2 episode is only going to be the NFC home games, and then I'm going to do the AFC home games tomorrow on a Part 3 episode, which will also include the 3-team parlay of the week with Chris Navarra. And Chris and Adam, I had to talk to these guys, and this is Week 4. This is the last week. If neither of these guys win us any money this week, I might have to call an audible and take over the play calling duties as far as the FanDuel lineup and the 3-team parlay of the week go, because we can't keep losing every week. Sometimes changes need to happen. So, as I said, NFC home games. First one we got here is the Buccaneers at the Los Angeles Rams. The Bucs DST is surprisingly playing really well so far. They are allowing the second fewest fantasy points to running backs, the 10th fewest receptions to running backs, and it's last week it was another 15 touch day for Todd Gurley, which looks like this is going. It looks like this team's content with just giving him 15-16 touches a game. So I'm kind of tempering my expectations here because I don't expect Todd Gurley to do much against this Bucs defense, which is surprisingly playing pretty well against running backs. Cooper Kupp seems to be the one benefiting the most from Todd Gurley's lack of involvement. Gurley only targeted 6 times so far in the first 3 games. It seems like a lot of those quick RB targets that were last year are now going to Cooper Kupp, which is why we're seeing him getting 12 targets like we saw him get last week, and I think it was 10 the week before that. Robert Woods seems to be somewhat, taking the crap end of this stick. He's still yet to score a touchdown. He's averaging only 47 yards a game, but he's still getting his targets. 8 last week, 23 on the season. So don't freak out if you're a Robert Woods owner. Not all 3 of these wide receivers are going to eat every week. Some weeks it's going to be 1 or 2 of them. Some weeks only 1 of them. And it just hasn't been Robert Woods' week yet. So I'm giving it another couple weeks before I start freaking out. Ronald Jones, looking at the Buccaneers here, Ronald Jones looked like the better running back in Week 3, but it seems like these guys will continue to split touches until one of them takes the job, the other one being Peyton Barber, of course. And I think both are worthy flexes this week. If you look at the Rams, they're allowing the 9th most fantasy points to running backs. It's a good matchup for them, and the Buccaneers are going to have to run the ball a little bit here. They can't just throw the ball to Mike Evans 15 times again like they did last week. He had an awesome game last week, almost 200 yards on 3 touchdowns. Definitely did not look sick anymore. And, these were kind of the games I was expecting from Mike Evans, with there being no Deshaun Jackson there, no Adam Humphries to compete with for targets. And he also, he kind of has a tough matchup here, actually. The Rams right now are allowing the second fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. So those Rams corners are playing well. Maybe this is the game that O.J. Howard finally, breaks out of his shell. Yeah, he had 66 yards last week, which is nice, but I think a lot of us were expecting more out of him again because of those two wide receivers that are gone. It's pretty much now just Evans, Godwin, and Howard catching the ball, and of course Cam Brate, who just finds his way into red zone targets every year. Next game we're going to go to, I got to turn my clicker on here. Seattle Seahawks going over to play the Arizona Cardinals in a division game, NFC West. Both of these teams coming off of a loss last week. Russell Wilson threw the ball more last week and had more passing yards. He threw the ball more ever than he did in his entire career last week, and he had more passing yards than he'd have since Week 7 in 2017. They definitely do not want to have to throw the ball this much. They want to rely on the run game, but they kind of got out of that game script pretty early against the Saints, who kind of jumped on them early. And you look at Tyler Lockett, who got a third of Russell Wilson's targets last week. He had a huge day, caught 11 of 14 for 154 and a touchdown. He's clearly the guy that Russell likes to throw at. He's clearly the guy he's got the most chemistry with, which makes sense. He's been on the team for the longest now. But DK Metcalf had another decent game for a rookie. He only caught 2 of his 6 targets for 67 yards, but you got to figure if he can catch at least half of those passes, give you a nice little 7-8 point floor. That's not bad at all for a rookie wide receiver. The guy I'm most excited about on this Seahawks team is actually Will Dissly, who saw 7 targets versus the Saints. That was the second most on the team, and this was days before the Seahawks agreed to trade their backup tight end, Nick Vannett, to the Steelers. Dissly has the best matchup for tight ends this week. The Cardinals are awful against tight ends. They're giving up the most fantasy points per week, per game to tight ends. So fire up Will Dissly in your DFS lineups this week. He's probably not all that expensive, and someone that is definitely going to get used looking at this matchup and looking at how much he was targeted even just last week. Looking at the Cardinals here, I'm loving David Johnson this week. He is one of the studs in DFS that I'm okay paying up for in this week. After getting the second most targets on the team last week while still getting 11 carries, he's getting this matchup. The Seahawks are actually allowing the 7th most receptions and the 4th most receiving yards to running backs, and we know this Cardinals offense. They want to dump off the ball. They want to get it out quick. So I can see David Johnson really being used more so as a slot receiver and as a receiver out of the backfield than as a runner this week. So I'm very excited about him. Christian Kirk with his second double-digit target day in 3 games. He's only averaged 6 yards per reception, but in a PPR league, you'll take 10 catches a game any day. And Larry Fitzgerald, continuing to have another great season. He was dropped in a standard league that I'm in, and I dropped TJ Hawkinson to add him. I couldn't believe that Fitzgerald was available. I mean, I get it, it's a standard league, but he's just so consistent, and he's one of the best players on that team. Okay, going on to our next game here. We got the Vikings playing at the Bears, an NFC North game here. Both of these teams coming off of a win. This is going to be a strength versus strength, 2 very good defenses. Dalvin Cook with 4 touchdowns, 300-yard games already, and he's averaging 20 touches a game versus this Bears defense that allows the 4th fewest fantasy points to running backs and the fewest receptions to running backs. So after Cook was targeted 5 times, caught 4 of them for 33 yards, nice little extra 5 points in even in half PPR league. I don't expect to see much of that against this Bears team. They pretty much shut your running backs down. As far as the Vikings wide receivers, man, am I glad I avoided these guys on at draft season, especially Diggs. He's averaging 6 fantasy points a game this season. He'll still have a couple big games, but he's definitely going to be one of these boomer bust guys in this offense that clearly wants to run the ball. Even Alexander Mattson had 12 carries last week, so they ran the ball almost 40 times last week. More than that, actually. And this Bears defense, they're tough, man. They're really tough. So, you're still playing Dalvin Cook just because he's emerged as probably a top 5 running back going forward. But just temper your expectations. And if I'm a Thielen or Diggs owner, I'm concerned for sure. Looking at the Bears team, we saw Trubisky in this offense kind of focus more on the quick throws and getting the ball out fast, moving Trubisky a little bit in the pocket and not necessarily asking him to drop back and dissect the defense. And he had a good game, and this team had a good game. Trubisky threw for 3 touchdowns. He also had that stupid pick. But Taylor Gabriel is the one who obviously benefited the most. If you look at his game, he pretty much had the game of his life. 6 catches on 7 targets for 3 touchdowns. As a David Montgomery owner in one league, it's in a half PPR league, it's nice seeing him targeted 3 times in game 2 and 3 so far this season. I think a lot of worry with him was that he wouldn't be involved at all in the passing game because of Tyreek Cohen being there, but he's still involved. Yeah, he only caught 1 pass. He caught all 3 of them. My bad. But probably the biggest disappointment so far this year for the Bears has been Trey Burton, who's dealing with an injury to start the season, but still only 25 yards on 6 catches so far this season. Major bust. He was, probably he was in the top 10 as far as tight ends being drafted this season, so definitely a bust there. Moving on to the Redskins and the Giants, got a lot of division games this week. Another game like this from Case Keenum, and we're probably going to see Dwayne Haskins sooner rather than later. Keenum with 3 interceptions, and he also fumbled 3 times, lost 2 of them. I think the Redskins are going to want to focus on the run in this game, with the Giants allowing the 8th most fantasy points to running backs. So, fire up Adrian Peterson, I guess. Chris Thompson is the guy that I'm obviously more so looking to start as far as these running backs go, because he is used in the pass game so much. But yeah, this may be like one of the only games where Adrian Peterson actually can get some legit carries throughout the entire game. One guy you're probably not worried about if you have him on your team is Terry McLaurin, averaging 6 catches, 8 targets, 86 yards, and a touchdown in every single game so far this season. He looks legit, and you got to figure, even if this inevitable quarterback change does happen, that his value will only go up. Don't forget that he played with Haskins at Ohio State together. Actually saw a stat last week, something like this is the first time that a quarterback wide receiver tandem was drafted in the top 3 rounds from the same team in a very long time. So that's a pretty cool thing. Hopefully, if Haskins does start, we see Terry McLaurin. I still got to learn how to pronounce this guy's name. See what they can do together. As far as the Giants go, obviously the big surprise was Daniel Jones coming in and playing really well. Threw for 336 yards with 2 touchdowns. And then he also ran for 2 touchdowns. Showing us why the coaches were so excited about getting him involved, because of the extra element that he brings. He's going to have to work on ball security, because he did lose both of the fumbles that he dropped on the floor there. Saquon goes down in this game, and yet they still win. But obviously he's extremely important to that team, and they're going to have to get by without him. We'll see what life without Saquon looks like, and we'll get a good look at Wayne Gallman here, who this might be the only real shot he's going to get, considering the next 2 games are versus the Vikings and at New England. So I don't see him giving us too much fantasy production in those games. So if you were one like me who is in a league where I really need help at running back, I picked him up off the waiver wire. I'm starting him this week, and then hopefully I can try and sell high to the Saquon owner and pretty much get whatever I can, really. We saw Sterling Shepard have an awesome game, his first big game really this season after the concussion that he had knocked him out of game 1, and he missed game 2. So with this being the last game before Golden Tate returns, I expect another big game for Shepard and for Ingram. Both of them had 8 and 9 targets, 6 and 7 receptions. Both of them had over 100 yards and a touchdown. So. And this Redskins defense is actually allowing the second most fantasy points to wide receivers. So these are guys that these are the matchups you want to look for, in my opinion, as far as DFS goes. I'm circling him right now, and I'm gonna throw him in a lineup for sure. Moving on to the Titans at the Falcons. The Titans allowed 9 sacks to the Jaguars DST last week. This O-line got beat up. I expect this team to try and really run the ball more and try and use more of that quick passing game, kind of like what we saw the Bears do last week. Adam Humphries tied Delaney Walker last week with the most targets on the team. Humphries had 93 yards on 6 catches. They both were targeted 9 times. And so I think that's kind of going to be this game plan for the Titans until they get this offensive line figured out. And the Falcons' D-line is not all that bad either. So the other thing I expect to see from the Titans is to get Dion Lewis a little more involved. The Falcons are allowing the 9th most receiving yards to running backs. That's obviously something that Dion Lewis does very well. So maybe he's a DFS flyer too, or if you're someone that for whatever reason has been holding on to Dion Lewis, this seems like the week to play him against this Falcons DST. As far as the Falcons go, finally a big game for Devonta Freeman, 19 carries. Throughout the first 2 weeks, he only had 16 carries. He was targeted 4 times. It took a first quarter exit from Ito Smith, who was dealing with a concussion, in order for Freeman to get this work. But I think it's reassuring to the coaching staff that, yes, if we give this guy 16 carries, that he can give us an 88-yard game, that they can actually rely on him to pick up some yardage on the ground. So maybe this was a good thing for him going forward. Maybe we don't see as much of a 60-40, 50-50 type of split with Ito Smith going forward. Maybe it's more now of a 75-25 type thing. Maybe it's just wishful thinking, but we'll have to wait and see. And obviously, Ito Smith's going to have to wait to be cleared to play in Week 4 with this concussion. And if he doesn't get cleared, Freeman is definitely worth playing in DFS lineups because I think he's one of the cheaper starting running backs as well. The one guy that kind of had a bad game last week on this Falcons team was Calvin Ridley, who he played on 75% of the snaps, but he was only targeted once. He is dealing with some kind of hip injury, and so maybe that's what kind of hampered him. So we'll give him a pass this week, but hopefully this does not continue. Another big game for Austin Hooper, who was used heavily, targeted 7 times, caught 6 of them for 66 yards and 2 touchdowns, including I think he had a red zone target in there. And not to toot my own horn or anything, but I did say in the beginning of the season that it seems like Austin Hooper is in line to have a nice season with this coaching staff that he's got. Moving on to the Chiefs and the Lions, a game that I expect to be kind of a shootout. I expect another heavy workload for Kerryon Johnson. Last week we saw him get 20 carries. With the Lions trying to eat clock, and anytime you're playing one of these high-powered offenses, you got to try and keep the ball. And it's not a bad matchup for him either. The Chiefs are allowing the 9th most fantasy points so far this season to running backs, so I'm excited about Kerryon this week. After 2 weeks of Kenny Golladay having the big games, we saw Marvin Jones have the big game last week against this Eagles defense. I was hanging out watching the game with one of my many Eagle friends, and he had Marvin Jones on his team, but he sat him, so that's got to be the worst feeling when you got a guy on your fantasy team that you sit because he's playing against your team and he goes off. But both of these guys should be played this week, and again, what I think is going to eventually become a shootout with these two offenses. Patrick Mahomes looks like he's on his way to another MVP season, put up another 375-yard game with 3 touchdowns against one of the best defenses in the league, the Ravens D. It's just ridiculous. These two young wide receivers, Hardman and Robinson, they're scoring at a ridiculous clip. They're scoring a touchdown on every 5 targets, which will obviously not continue all season, but as long as Tyreek Hill is out, I think you can continue to start them and pretty much count on Patrick Mahomes doing his thing and finding these guys deep. So, and this week with the Lions probably being out with one of their best corners, Darius Slay, these Chiefs wide receivers should have good opportunities. You don't really need a good opportunity when you got Pat Mahomes throwing you the ball, but they could have a good game again. So get them in your lineup for sure. And the last game here on the Week 4 Part 2 episode of the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast, the NFC home games. We got the Cowboys going and playing the Saints. Both of these teams coming off of pretty lopsided wins. Amari Cooper is dealing with an ankle sprain, but apparently he'll most likely play in Week 4, and he's got the best matchup in the game. The Saints are allowing the third most fantasy points to wide receivers right now. The Saints are also allowing forgot to skip here. Saints are also allowing the second most receptions and the 6th most receiving yards to running backs. So with Amari kind of being limited and them still being without Michael Gallup, I expect this to be a huge game for Zeke Elliott. He'll get his 15 to 20 carries, but I expect him to get, probably 5 or 6 targets as well. Expect him to be used more in the pass game and with this matchup. So to me, he's the other stud in the NFC home games that is worth that I'm willing to pay up for this week in DFS. And another one is Alvin Kamara, simply because it seems like without Drew Brees, the plan is to just use Kamara 25 times a game like they did last week. Targeted him 10 times, let him rush the ball 16 times. And, we don't usually see that kind of workload from Alvin Kamara. Even last year when Mark Ingram was suspended, he wasn't getting this much work. It must have just been a matchup that the Saints wanted to exploit and targeting Kamara more than even Michael Thomas, who still scored, but he's got the toughest matchup in this game. The Cowboys are allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, but you're still going to start Michael Thomas. He's you probably drafted him in the first round, so you can't sit those guys. You just got to hope that Teddy Bridgewater can continue to keep him relevant. And 60 yards and a touchdown, you'll take that any day. So if he can continue to keep Michael Thomas relevant, and then when Drew Brees comes back, you'll go right back to having a top 5, top 6 wide receiver. So that does it for part 2 of the of the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you check out part 3 with the AFC home games. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. For more episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Beers and Bruisers is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach TV, or your favorite podcast service. Beers and Bruisers is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com or download the free HC Universal Network app today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gaming operates a national problem gambling helpline network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to drink responsibly and always look for your man downfield.